More nuclear weapons, fewer soldiers, and a shift towards Asia. The UK resets its global strategy after Brexit. But can the UK still be a big global player after leaving the European Union? And will its new blueprint help? This is Roundtable. Hello, I'm Shuli Ghosh. Increasing its stockpile of nuclear weapons is just one part of the UK's vision for the future. It's placing a bigger emphasis on defence against threats in what the government calls an increasingly competitive world. Last week, the British government revealed its integrated review, signalling a shift in its foreign policy, aiming to define the UK's place as a world leader. The review emphasised the importance of boosting alliances in the Indo-Pacific region, describing it as increasingly the geopolitical centre of the world, while Europe's security remains a priority.
Britain will remain unswervingly committed to NATO and preserving peace and security in Europe. And from this secure basis, we will seek out friends and partners wherever they can be found, building a coalition for openness and innovation, and engaging more deeply in the Indo-Pacific.
Among the other key elements of the UK report, the threats posed by China and Russia, an emphasis on cyber warfare in national defence, and a shift towards new technologies such as battlefield drones. Part of the plan is to reduce the size of the army by 10,000 soldiers, which could leave Britain at risk, according to one former UK Army chief. The review also disclosed a plan to increase a cap on the number of nuclear warheads held by the UK by more than 40%, prompting criticism from anti-nuclear campaigners. But will the plan secure the UK's place on the world stage? And what will its allies and rivals make of it? Let me introduce today's guests. Joining us on Roundtable from Singapore, Raffaello Pantucci, Senior Associate Fellow at the think tank RUSI. In London, we have Sir Simon Fraser, former head of the UK Diplomatic Service and Managing Partner of Flint Global, and Robert Fox, Defence Editor at the London Evening Standard. Gentlemen, great to see all of you. So this integrated review, very comprehensive document, 115 pages, laying out Britain's foreign policy vision for the future. Robert, let me start with you. I know you've written a lot about this. Do you think it is the right way forward for the UK to deal with the new threats that we have in the world now?
Well, I'd like to say about the document itself, it was a bit of a surprise because it had been quite undersold in various leaks, and a lot of people that had seen bits of it said that, you know, it's the same as before, there's nothing very new. But in fact, it was very clever because it isn't a policy document and it isn't a strategy. So what is it? It's a framing document which sets out 4 areas of argument, which is saying these are the things we have to think about and these are our thoughts so far. And there were, without being absolutely outright surprises, there were some surprising emphases. And I got a very strong inference. My takeaway was that, yes, we are on the cusp of something really new. And I'll give you just one, for instance, that indicated this. It was John Bew, because it's Professor John Bew's work that is the final hand in this. John Bew emphasizes the impact of quantum mechanics, the quantum revolution, and what it's going to do for all of us. Now, it was quite unusual to feed that into the discussion, and it's very, very important to part of the framework.
Simon, what are your thoughts? Because the feeling is very much that the UK is leaving the EU. It has to carve out its place in the world. So Robert's saying some of the contents of the document are surprise. What's your view?
Well, I agree that it was important, now that we've left the EU, that we had this statement giving some flesh to this concept of global Britain. And I think the review is a very credible attempt to do that. And I agree that there's a lot of interesting thinking in it. I take a slightly different view, though, on quite how innovative it is. I mean, there are new things. I think this whole idea of integrating domestic and international policy, and as has been said, bringing science and technology into closer to security policy, that is very interesting and important. But if you look at the overall picture of Britain's role in the world, it is actually quite a familiar picture, a focus on diplomacy with global reach, soft power, the relationship with the United States, the importance of NATO. All these things are actually quite a lot of continuity alongside the new elements that Robert's described.
And Raffaello, if we look at some, let's delve into some of the things that the integrated review was saying. A lot was made, for example, of the UK's decision to tilt more towards the Indo-Pacific region. Now, as far as I'm aware, that's not a new position. There's been a lot of talk that this is the direction that a lot of Western countries want to go in. For you, how much of a shift is this in current UK policy?
I mean, I think as you correctly articulate, this is not hugely new, and it's also the direction that everyone else is going in. There is a kind of general recognition in most major capitals around the world, not just Western ones, that, the global center of gravity has shifted to Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, or however you want to term it. And that recognition is kind of woven through this document. In some ways, what was interesting was that actually the document articulated a kind of vision towards the Indo-Pacific, which kind of built on a policy that the UK has been trying to do for some time. It still hasn't quite put the detail in there of how it's going to achieve it. But actually what was interesting was the recognition that, in fact, the UK remains a very important Euro-Atlantic power. And I think what was interesting was the degree to which that was actually prioritized in a lot of the discussions, as well as the science issue, which I think both of the others have correctly identified as a clearly critical and important element that was highlighted in it. In some ways, this sort of tilt to the Indo-Pacific was actually nowhere near as sort of heavy, I think, as maybe was being promulgated in the sort of leaks and reports that have been put out before.
I can see the other two guests are nodding at that. Let me just explain what Boris Johnson said about this when he was presenting his blueprint for future policy to Parliament, when he was talking about specifics on how the UK was going to look towards the Indo-Pacific region. This is what he had to say.
Our approach will place diplomacy first, and the UK has applied to become a dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and we will seek to join the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement.
So, Robert, what do you make of that? Clearly the tilt towards the Indo-Pacific region, the Asia-Pacific region, is to counter the rising assertiveness of China.
Well, I don't think so, actually. I think it's about something else. And it's quite obvious. It's, as both Raffaello and Simon Fraser have pointed out, this is a historic, it's a movement of where you predict history is going to take you. And it's for improved trade, improving the economy. We're not looking to EU Europe, and it's got to be there because so much of global trade is going to be carried over the oceans in the Indo-Pacific area. This has been predicted and forecast for a long time. And here I think we have to come to a fundamental, which is implicit in the document, though not spelled out. This is a dichotomy. It's a seed of two halves. A lot of the headlines have been about defense, whether it's nuclear warheads or how many fewer troops you're going to have. But in fact, much of it is really about security. And security because this island cannot support itself of its own means, domestic means, in energy and food. Now, in the 19th century, the imperial maxim was trade follows the flag. What I think Boris was trying to say, and by the way, and I'm going to be thoroughly disloyal, he has been a friend in the past, I thought the Boris Johnson personal contribution, both in the introduction to the paper and in Parliament, was amongst the weakest articulation of this. But what we are really saying is that the flag now follows the trade. That's why we're going into the Indo-Pacific. That's why we have to be there. We cannot allow China to be so dominant, and it's how we have strategic competition with China is another big implicit question in this document. And I think that we're the UK. I have to say feel in an odd way, being a Europhile, I think it's being more mature and interesting about this than perhaps the Europeans, where China is now in among their midst, and it is a very important European player. Look what they're doing with European ports.
Do you agree with that, Simon? And what countries do you think the UK is most likely to deepen its alliances with?
Well, I certainly agree with the point that this is a trend in policy which has been going on for some time. When I was running the Foreign Office, I started being the Permanent Secretary in 2010. We had a big shift of resources towards the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. Of course, what happened was that we again got sidetracked by the Arab Spring and other events in Europe. And you have to remember things happen close to home, which we have to deal with. But nevertheless, it is continuity and stepping up of a policy which has begun before. It's partly about trade. It's partly about reaching out to friendly countries in the region. But behind that, let's be clear, lies this question of China. As the report says, how we react to China and the growth of China's economic, political and military power is the biggest geopolitical question ahead of us. Britain needs to address that in partnership with countries in the region like Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, but also with our European and North American partners. And that's why actually we need to stay close to the Europeans as we look at this region, just as we do to other countries.
Yeah, I mean, Raffaello, I suppose that the UK wants a deeper engagement in that region, but not at the cost of alliances with the EU and NATO and the Five Eyes security grouping.
No, certainly not. And I think that there's no indication, I think, in the document or any other behavior that there is a drift in that direction. One could even argue that, you know, the way that the document phrases its sort of Indo-Pacific narratives, talking about China as a systemic rival, I mean, that's exactly, you know, almost word for word what the EU has just been saying about China. So in some ways, you could see that the document is trying to show this sort of proximity and alignment to European partners to lay the groundwork for greater cooperation there. I think the one point I would say about this, though, is I think there has to be some attention. And I think there is a realization of this in London. I think in part this is why, you know, there has been some accusation that this document isn't necessarily as clear on China as people seem to want. And I think that, you know, there is a sense that we need to see the world in this binary sense of China as an adversary or an ally. And I think that's frankly a childish interpretation of the world, because that's not really how the world works. And I think when you're talking about the world's second largest economy, it's pretty much impossible to function in that sort of binary fashion. And I think every country around the world is having this dilemma, where on the one hand you see the opportunity in China, and on the other hand you see the challenge. And it's how you navigate your way through the middle. And I think that's very important. But I think what's really important for that is alliances. And I think where this document is really going to sort of stand up and build into a real sort of strategy and vision for the UK in the future, in the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, is how it engages with other alliances. And then as long as it makes sure that the UK isn't seeing this entire region through the lens of China. I think that was possibly one of the issues that the UK faced in the past when it had its famous Osborne-Cameron golden era or golden age relationship with China. Was the interpretation in Asia was that we only saw China and then everything else came second. And of course, all these other countries think they're quite big, important countries too.
Can I interrupt at that point? I think Raffaello has made a terribly important point about both documents, both the integrated review and the defence command paper. I think the acid test, I absolutely agree with you, is the allies. How the allies react to this, how they take up, there's quite a big offer to come in, join us, help us develop our defences. And one of the hidden things, I agree entirely about this depiction by Raffaello, excellent, wonderful, about the way we see China. It's China and it is dominant. It's terribly important. I cannot possibly second guess Simon on this, but it's absolutely dead right. But it's what privately Australia, Japan in particular, but countries like Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and even Indonesia are saying to us, because I think that I agree with both my colleagues here, what we're presenting, and I do blame my trade for this, the media, we are being presented a sort of binary view of either you trade or give in to China, or you confront, and let's go for a punch-up in short order in the South China Sea over Taiwan. I mean, that is just fantasy. That's comic book stuff. But it really is terribly important. And I think that this is where, as Sir Simon was saying, diplomacy is terribly, terribly important, because across the piece, these two documents are only going to work is not only what the close allies are saying to us, but what the newer allies are saying to us. And by the way, that is, I think, the very important thing with Europe. It's picking up Europe as allies, and through the alliance of NATO, you're quite absolutely right. There's a tremendous neuralgia about anything with the initials EU written on it.
Can we also address the other another part of the equation, which is Russia? Of course, not much happens in foreign policy without bringing Russia into it. And one of the things that the UK has decided to do, which has caused some consternation, is lift its cap on nuclear stockpile. The reaction from Russia was, as you can imagine, negative. A Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said this was a serious blow to stability and security. He said, "We are very sorry that Britain has chosen the path of increasing the number of nuclear warheads. This decision will harm international stability and strategic security." I'm sure we could all predict that we would have that kind of reaction from Russia. But Simon, is that the right way to go about addressing a threat like Russia? Because for decades, the UK has been moving backwards from nuclear proliferation. And now suddenly we're saying, actually, nuclear deterrence is what we need to look at. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to worry too much about statements made by Russian spokesmen about destabilizing the international situation. Yeah. Let's be real about this. What the review does, very interestingly, whereas actually I think it deals with China in quite a sophisticated way. On Russia, it's very clear. It identifies Russia as the major state threat, if you like, in conventional nuclear terms, old-fashioned politico-military terms, if you like, and therefore is advocating a sort of pretty hard line on Russia. Now, that can be expressed in many ways. The nuclear aspect is interesting. Of course, the decision of this document to continue with the independent nuclear deterrent is another area of continuity in British policy. I'm not an expert on deterrence. Others may be, Robert, or others may be. But if you're going to have one, then I think you need one that works, that is actually a deterrent. And the decision has been made on the basis, I think, of the threat perception and the science that there needs to be a fairly small increase in the number of warheads. I don't see that is necessarily in any way a hostile or aggressive act. If it's what's needed to make your deterrent an effective deterrent, then I can go along with that.
Where do you stand on this, Raffaello? And how do you think Russia will respond to that?
I mean, I think I'd agree with Sir Simon that, it seems to me if you're going to have a nuclear deterrent, it needs to be a deterrent, and it needs to be effective, and it needs to be credible. And so I think clearly there was a sense maybe that it was starting to slip in a certain direction and needed to be bolstered. So I think that makes sense to me as a sort of strategic choice. I also think Russia's response is fairly predictable. I think Russia has always, thrown its toys out of the pram when these issues happen, and always wants to find a reason to sort of stoke these angers. I mean, at the end of the day, sanctions are still biting into Russia as a result of its actions in Ukraine, and that hasn't sort of been forgiven and forgotten. So Russia has taken a very adversarial position towards the West and towards the United Kingdom for some time now. There's been effort to try to reconnect and re-engage, but Russia's made it very clear where it sort of stands on these issues.
Doesn't this undermine the UK's credibility as a proponent of ending nuclear proliferation? I mean, Robert, if the UK has decided that it's going to allow proliferation, this sends the wrong message, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's aspiration against practicality, as both as Raffaello and Sir Simon have said. This is something of the moment, because the reality is there's a great deal of concern that anti-missile systems are getting ahead, as you put it, that actually this is having an effect on the credibility of the UK and therefore the US and even the French deterrent. And by the way, I think all the capitals would have talked about this and discussed that. But there is a great deal of concern about Russia and Russia's behavior, because I'm not telling tales out of school, but I was having a discussion with the head of the armed services, Chief of Defence Staff, Nick Carter, the other day, and he said that one of the aspects that really worries him about Russia is Russia as a power, although they're trying to project completely the opposite, is in decline. Demographically, they're in trouble. There's the problem of social cohesion and the effect of COVID, etc., etc. But on nuclear, curiously, Russia feels terribly vulnerable because suddenly, against the run of play, they have said, we will continue with New START. I'm sure this is the strategic arms reduction talks. We'll let them run on for another 5 years. They were due up in 2 or 3 months' time. But what they're really worried about is not the US. They're desperate to get China aboard in strategic arms reduction. And China isn't playing ball at the moment.
Just before we go back to the main discussion, Robert, I'm quite interested. You were talking to Nick Carter. What does he think about the reduction of 10,000 British soldiers then? How does that gel with Britain's pledge to engage militarily in more arenas?
It gels very badly with me because it's nonsense. It's not a reduction of 10,000. Shock and amazement. It's a reduction of about 3.5, maximum 4,000. We've never had 82,000 troops in the British Army ready for action for more than 10 years.
So it was fake news, was it?
Absolutely. The fully trained strength of the British Army currently is a shade over 76,000. The fact that they're saying we're going to have a fully trained strength of 72,500, I don't think is too bad, because that you've got to have something you can manage, and what they were not managing terribly well is recruitment. So they don't have that. The most interesting thing is in the way that we're going to use the forces or see the forces used is the pledge to have a reserve of 30,100. I don't understand what the 100 are there. And this has been propelled by COVID. And again, Sir Nick Carter was telling me they really intend to make this work and pay for it. And
okay.
The governments up until now, since the 2010 review, have not done that.
Okay, so just as we come towards the end of the discussion, I mean, we need to pose the question, do you think this new approach is going to successfully keep Britain as a first-tier power as we go ahead now without being a member of the EU? Simon, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I don't think it actually aspires for the UK to be a first-tier power. I think what it's looking at is how the UK can play a role as a middle power, if you like, a significant middle power through relationships and through focusing on the right issues. And I think it's a good first step, but I think there's a lot in there. Probably it needs to prioritize more. And we need to think about the relationships that we've been talking about in order to help us achieve those goals. And of course, you need to have resources. And we are in an economic crisis, and there will be pressure on budgets, not only the defence budget, we've reduced the aid budget as well. So if you don't have the credibility through the resources, it's quite difficult. My very final point is this. There is one very big hole in the middle of this review, and that is the UK's future relationship with the European Union. And you know, there is very little in there about how we're going to work collectively with the European Union, as opposed with individual European countries, on some of the very big issues like climate change, the future international health agenda, and also the regulation of technology and science, where the EU will be a major player. And we've got to address that. We've got to get over this hurdle, the post-Brexit hurdle, of frankly being in a sort of adversarial position with the EU, who are some of our closest and most enduring partners in international affairs.
Raffaello, what's your final thought on this? Is it going to have an impact on Britain's approach in future?
I mean, the real question is in delivery. I mean, the thing about this document, it is a big vision. It's articulating what the United Kingdom is going to look like. In many ways, what the global Britain brand, which was so widely touted around, actually kind of means. But what we don't know is how it's ultimately going to be delivered. And I think that's really going to be the key aspect of this entire conversation. I think there is a really worrying aspect to it in terms of the United Kingdom trying to do everything at the same time in a time when, as was pointed out, we're going to have tightened budgets. And I think the cut of the aid budget is something that's very significant within that. I think the UK got a huge amount of soft power, which translates into very useful power around the world through its huge aid budget through DFID. And I think care is going to have to really be made to make sure that that number is brought back up and that the UK continues to be really a soft power superpower in those terms around the world. And that doesn't sort of fall victim to the cuts in budgets. The government said that it will stick to that, but I think that's going to be a really important one. And I think it's really going to be a question of focusing attention and keeping that attention focused. I think the sort of Indo-Pacific vision, as it's been articulated, I mean, I think it was, it wasn't maybe as essential as it was kind of sold in a way, but it's been going on for some time. I mean, some of these narratives of engaging with Asia, this is the new center of economic gravity of the world, this is not new. The problem is it hasn't been followed through. And so I think the real question is, what are the tools and how is it going to be deployed in practice to actually deliver outcomes for the United Kingdom as a power on the world stage?
Interesting stuff. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Great to have you on the programme. Raffaello Pantucci, Sir Simon Fraser and Robert Fox. And you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye, and thanks for watching.